All right, the broad topic of today's reading is marriage. And related to that topic, we're going to read 3 of our own essays, along with some aphorisms by 2 other writers. Ellen and I celebrated our 58th anniversary this year, and even though that's not a landmark number, thank you, it's been cause for reflection. The first 2 essays are specifically on the topic of retirement, and we chose them because along with births and deaths and moving from one house to another, retirement is one of the major events in many marriages. I'm going to start off with an essay entitled, "And What Do You Do?" There are turning points in life, forks in the road, where a choice is made, a decision is taken, and the course of a life is changed. Some choices affect the way we perceive ourselves, alter the way others perceive us, or change who we are. Those choices create a distinct before and after in life because the person who existed before the choice is not the person who exists after, either in reality or as perceived. An identity disappears and a new identity takes its place. And sometimes the decision is made without awareness of what the consequences will be, of the magnitude, the gravity of changing direction. Both the loss of an old identity and the assumption of a new identity can be devastating for a person who is not prepared, who is taken unaware by the change. And for many, retirement is just such an event because it can entail a loss of identity without the creation of a well-defined new one, or the creation of a new one that is defined but not what was expected, or one that is not welcomed or accepted, or, most important of all, one that is simply not sufficient. Some years ago, Ellen and I attended a 3-day meditation retreat taught by a Buddhist monk named Shan Wei, a student of Thich Nhat Hanh. In preparation for the event, he instructed participants to ask themselves, "Who am I?" It was the first time I had encountered this classic query, and I quickly came up with a list of responses, thinking it a rather easily answered question. I am a scientist, a father, a husband, a tennis player, a cook. The list was long and easily extended. But then I realized that although all these statements were true and correct answers, they were correct answers to different questions, such as, what do I do? What roles do I play in my various relationships? And, most interesting, how am I perceived by others? And I suddenly saw that I had no idea how to answer Shan Wei's question. I didn't know who I was. I clearly had an identity in that I could recognize myself and others could recognize me on the basis of things that I did, things that led others to perceive me as my activities defined me. But if I stopped doing those things, if I walked away from career, family, hobbies, who or what would remain? Who was the I who performed the tasks and carried out the activities? In our career-oriented society, we are quick to ask and answer the question, what do you do? And until a Buddhist monk brought it to my attention, it never occurred to me that what I did didn't define who I was. Until faced with his preparatory, "Who am I?" challenge, I didn't know that I was unaware of my identity, or that there even existed an I unrelated to the things I did, the roles I played, or the responsibilities I met. And I think that it's this state of unenlightenment, this lack of awareness of an identity separate from one's activities, that can make retirement a traumatic event. Before retirement, when meeting someone new, I easily answered the inevitable question, "What do you do?" with, "I'm a research scientist." But after retirement, I had no easy answer. "I'm retired" seemed like an evasion, a non-answer, a way to put a positive spin on, "I don't do anything." Adding, "I used to be a research scientist" seemed desperate, almost pathetic, an attempt to deny the present and cling to past capabilities and accomplishments. And the alternative, creating a response linked to hobbies or volunteer activities, doesn't feel sufficient. because the question asks more than what one's interests are or how one fills one's day. It asks what justifies one's existence, what creates meaning in one's life, what makes one unique and of value to society. And work, creative, compensated work, seem to be the key to a sufficient response. My approach to retirement reflected my approach to life in general. I considered possible outcomes and their probabilities, their costs and benefits, and I designed and carried out experiments to test my hypotheses. In the years leading up to retirement, Ellen and I had moved to the country, onto a 3-acre lot where I began creating gardens, some for flowers, but most for growing fruits and vegetables. I started learning to can, dry, and freeze produce, when and what to plant for best yields, how to care for poultry, developing an array of new hobbies and activities that could easily fill the days and weeks of a retired scientist with a love of food and cooking. As a way to test drive this anticipated way of life, I began taking a few days of vacation around weekends and holidays to create 5 or 7-day periods when I didn't leave the farm, when I had nothing to do except what I was planning to do in retirement. And I made sure that some of those test drives took place in bad weather, wet, cold, rainy, hot, humid weather, because of something a real rancher once told me. He was the father of a fellow graduate student, and he raised beef cattle, lots of them, on a ranch that spanned the Texas-Mexico border near El Paso. He was a man of few words, and the toll that his hard life's work had taken showed in his walk, on his hands, and in his face. I made some inane comment to him about how it would be fun to come to the ranch sometime to work with him, and he responded, "Everybody wants to be a cowboy in the springtime." I took the remark to heart, and almost 40 years later applied it to make sure I wasn't fooling myself by spending extended periods in the garden only in good weather, in the springtime, when everything is fresh and comfortable and everything seems possible. The results of the tests were positive in the good sense, and I convinced myself that I would be happy and contented spending the balance of my life planting, tending, harvesting, processing, and preparing the food to go on our table and into our bodies. All that remained was to figure out when would be the right time to walk away from the career that had been the focus of my life for so long, that had provided me with the identity that I perceived as who I was. And then one day I realized that the decision was being made for me by the workplace environment that was changing more rapidly than I could adapt. Technology was altering the way information was obtained and processed, and there was an expectation of constant connectivity. Rapidity of response was valued more than quality, depth of analysis was being devalued, and I was becoming obsolete, outdated, and at risk of embarrassing myself. I had recreated myself as many times as I could, mastered as many new areas of research as I had the energy for, and traded on my most basic skills for as long as they could be used. At the end of a particularly discouraging day, I came home and told Ellen, "If I have 3 bad days in a row, I'm quitting." Then after a few months, a new announcement. 2 bad days in a row, and that's it. And finally, the next bad day, I'm done. But as it turned out, it wasn't a bad day or even a series of them that finally brought me to retirement. Rather, it was the recognition that many, many days had passed in a row without giving me a feeling of satisfaction, without making me feel proud or energized. Work was just no longer fun. And when I told Ellen, over a dinner of homegrown vegetables and a duck egg omelet, she asked simply, "Are you sure it's what you want to do?" And when I said yes, that I was ready to stop doing what I had done my entire adult life, there was no feeling of doubt, no clenching unease in my belly, nothing to indicate that I was telling her or myself anything but the truth. The next day, when I called the Human Resources office to tell them of my decision and ask how to proceed, expecting that they would want to meet with me and lead me through an individualized process, expecting that someone would actually care, I was told that I just needed to go to the company website, click on Ready to Retire, fill out the information on screen, and click Submit. It was all automated. If I needed confirmation, a sign that it was truly time to go, an automated departure process was as good as any. And Submit. What a perfect bidirectional command to initiate this simultaneous ending and beginning. It's been almost 20 years since I retired, and I know it was the right decision taken at the right time. I came to the fork in the road, and I chose the right direction. Gardening and its associated activities were sufficient to keep me satisfied for a couple of years, and I've expanded into studies of philosophy and music and Kafka, and volunteer activities that utilize valuable skills, more than enough to fill my days, give meaning to life, and justify my experience. But I still don't have a comfortable answer for, and what do you do? And despite years of seeking, I still don't know the answer to Sean Way's question, who am I? Does anybody ever find the answer to that one? Now it's Ellen's turn. Thank you.
Okay. If you can't hear me or if there's a problem with the sound, Ed, if you'll just wave in the back. Okay. This one is called The Joy of Retirement. When we moved to North Carolina in 1987 for Phil's new job, Glaxo assigned us a realtor who kept trying to show us houses in Raleigh and Cary. We knew Phil would be working in Research Triangle Park, but not knowing where I would find work, we wanted to live in Durham because of its central location. We don't like house hunting, so after we had looked at 5 houses in one day, we were ready to buy, if only so we could stop looking. Fortunately, we liked the 6th house, which was in an older neighborhood in southwest Durham, 11 miles from RTP. It was an auspicious location since I too ended up working in RTP. After we installed compasses in our cars and figured out how not to get lost in downtown Durham, we came to appreciate the quirks of this former tobacco town that was home to Duke University. 10 years later, things changed, as they always do. My company moved to Raleigh, and Phil and I moved to the country north of Durham, just south of Virginia. I still enjoyed my job, but I hated the commute, even though it allowed me to travel on back roads and go through places with names like Stem and Shoefly. In spite of the fact that I had a pretty high-level job that required me to wear a suit or even a dress occasionally, I noticed that I started dressing down more and more. Casual Friday was becoming Casual Monday, Casual Tuesday, and Casual Wednesday as well. The dressy slacks turned into LL Bean corduroys, which turned into jeans. When my nice shoes gave way to loafers that gave way to sneakers, I remembered the career advice that said, don't dress for the job you have, dress for the job you want. Uh-oh, I was dressing for no job at all. It dawned on me that I was ready to leave a job that I'd loved for 10 years, but I held on longer than I should have because I was reluctant to go out into the world without an answer to the question, what do you do? Nothing was not an acceptable response. So I got busy coming up with answers. I raised chickens. We had a small backyard flock. I do editing work on contract. I did that twice. I'm a hospice volunteer. I was. I write a newsletter for hospice. I chair the county tourism board. I did. I take classes at Duke in its program for retired people. My intention was to take on some civic activities, make contacts, and get another job. I didn't hesitate to tell people that I had quit my job, but I never said I was retired. I didn't even think of myself as retired, which seemed to be a condition for much older people. At about that same time, in 1998, Hillary Clinton celebrated her 50th birthday and was on the cover of Time. The article featured several of Hillary's pals from Radcliffe, now all crowding around 50. The common theme was that after more or less high-powered careers, these women were feeling a need to do something different, to be of service. I was in good company. It was an age thing. But unlike Hillary, I could do nothing or next to nothing without someone writing an article about it. I had time to take long walks, to read and write without assignments, to join a gym, to take workshops or classes on any topic, to volunteer for anything that interested me, to learn new things. It was a heady time in the dictionary sense of intoxicating. I never did look for another job. It took several years, but I finally accepted the fact that I was retired. It helped that Phil and I took Spanish lessons and discovered that retired in Spanish translates as jubilado, which looks a lot like jubilant. Well, ole.
We're now going to read from these two little books, Don'ts for Husbands
and Don'ts for Wives.
These were found by Murtis and Bennett on one of their trips, and they bought them and brought them back and gave them to us. I think they probably wanted to make sure we made it to our 60th anniversary. These were written in 1913 by a woman named Blanche Berry Ebbett. She was British and probably a member of the upper echelons of society. She mentions the positions of cooks, maids, nannies, and even valets. Despite the 109 years that have elapsed since she wrote, and the many, many changes in societal norms that have occurred in that time, we think you'll agree that there's an ageless wisdom in her collection of don'ts. We'll start with Don'ts for Wives.
This is the preface. Art is a hard mistress, and there's no art quite so hard as that of being a wife. So many women exhaust their artistic power in getting married, which is, after all, a comparatively easy business. But it takes a perfect artist to remain married in the perfect sense of the term. But most of us have to be content to muddle through. Imagine a girl called upon without a single lesson to produce a tune, a lot of tunes, in fact, one never-ending succession of harmonies from the most difficult instrument in the world. Note that the instrument not only gets grumpy in cold weather and skittish in the spring, not only slacks or breaks its strings with every change of temperature, but becomes tempestuous over a tight shoe, broody over an out-of-date egg, and cross, sulky, or mirthful for reasons that no sane woman can understand. That's what the average wife has to reckon with, and if she intends to play the game, humiliating as some may think it, he will loom largely on the horizon all her life. I hope she may find it worthwhile to take a few hints from an old hand. Signed, Blanche Ebbett.
And my preface, my dear sir, you are neither as bad nor as good a fellow as you imagine yourself to be. No doubt you know a good deal about women, but if you're in the early years of your married life, not nearly as much as you will in another decade. In any case, I hope that when you have read my little book, you will thank me for having told you many things that otherwise you could have learned only by experience, more or less bitter, according to the discretion exercised by both by you and by your other half. Women, married or single, are kittle cattle. And as for men, well, I have a husband myself, Blanche Abbott.
This one is from Evenings at Home. Just don't fuss over your husband. Mistaken attentions often annoy a man who comes home late after a busy day and has a quiet little supper alone, and he doesn't want you to jump up like a jack-in-the-box with, "Would you like more pepper, darling?" Just see that everything is conveniently placed for him, and then leave the man alone while he eats. Let him feel your sympathetic presence near him, but occupy yourself in reading or doing needlework.
Under general habits, don't drop cigarette ash all over the drawing room carpet. Some people will tell you that it improves the colors, but your wife won't care to try that recipe. And don't throw cigar ends into the bowl of water your wife keeps in front of the gas fire. They are not ornamental, and she will not be pleased. And don't sharpen pencils all over the house as you walk about. Try a hearth or a wastepaper basket or a newspaper. It does not improve either carpets or the servant's temper to find scraps of pencil sharpenings all over the floors.
This is on everyone's favorite topic, food. Don't be careless about the way in which meals are served when you and your husband are alone. Dainty surroundings do much to make eating an agreeable process instead of mere means of keeping oneself alive. Don't give your husband stale bread if he prefers it new, nor new bread if it produces indigestion. Exercise a little thought in the matter.
Still on food, don't insist on having gorgonzola or other strong-smelling cheese on the table or sideboard twice a day when you know the odor makes your wife feel ill. After all, it is a small thing to forego in comparison with your wife's comfort.
Now moving to the topic of dress. Don't let your husband get into the habit of never noticing when you wear a new gown. Some men would be none the wiser if their wives wore sackcloth and ashes, but it's very discouraging to the wives.
Don't take so little interest in your wife's dress that she might as well wear a piece of old sacking as far as you're concerned. It is very discouraging to a woman to find out that her husband neither knows nor cares how she dresses.
Don't let your husband feel that it's a matter of indifference to you if he wears his socks wrong side out or odd boots on his feet. Some men are absent-minded, even enough for that. And if they can't keep a valet, their wives should see that they dress properly.
Don't be so absent-minded as to dress yourself just anyhow. Perhaps in the rush to get you off in time for your train, your wife may not notice that you're wearing odd socks, but she will be very uncomfortably conscious of it when she sees you again in the evening and wonders how many people may have happened to observe it during the day. She does her best, but you can't expect her actually to dress you.
Don't let your husband wear a violet tie with grass green socks. If he is unhappily devoid of the color sense, he must be forcibly restrained. But don't be sarcastic about your husband's taste in dress. Be gently persuasive and train his sense of fitness.
On the topic of children, don't always say, "Ask your mother." When you don't want to be bothered, it is conceivable that she doesn't either. And don't say, "That's not in my line," when your wife asks your advice about the children. It ought to be in your line. And don't stick too closely to the old adage that children should be seen and not heard. Of course, you must guard against their making nuisances of themselves, especially before visitors. They must learn not to come into the limelight too much, but you don't want to stifle self-expression. Encourage them to speak freely of their ideas.
Also, children, don't give baby the same name as his father and then have to talk of Big John and Little John, or of Old John and Young John. Call your husband always by his own name, and let your boys have names of their own too. Now, as an aside, I'll tell you that I grew up in a home where there were 2 Ellens and 2 Edwins, and there was a 3rd Edwin if you looked at grandfather, and my brother now has a 4th Edwin. So he hadn't had the benefit of this book. But Phil also grew up in a house of young Phil and old Phil, and his sister and mother had the same name too. So there you go, Janes and Phils. But our sons have their own names.
The last comment on marriage written by others comes from an article written by a woman named Malena Jasenka in 1923, just after the Don'ts books were written. I came across this while reading this book by Michelle Woods called Kafka Translated. It's a scholarly treatise. I have finished it. If anybody wants to borrow it and learn more about translating Kafka, you're welcome to it. Michelle wrote about who translated Kafka and how, and why they translated his work as they did. Now, Malena Jasenka was a journalist, a writer, an editor, and a translator, and her work is discussed in this book because she translated Kafka's short story, The Stoker, from German to Czech, and in doing that, she became the first person to translate Kafka from German into any language. In writing about Jasenka's motivation, why she translated the way she did, the author went into her marriages. Jasenka was married twice, and both her marriages were difficult. And she decided to publish an essay on the topic of marriage, which she entitled, "The Devil at the Hearth." The title may give you a hint. In it, she decried the illusions of marriage and the mistaken and illusionary equation of happiness with marriage. Here are a few quotes from her essay. "It is the task of marriage to tolerate the essence of the other, and to tolerate it in such a way that the other person feels justified in being the way he is. The function of a home is to protect and protect and protect an individual from the world, and mainly from his internal mirror. The promise given in a marriage should be, I won't let them get you." Now we're going to close with Ellen's essay on marriage, titled Opposites Attract. As you listen, I hope you'll remember Jasenka's advice about tolerate the essence of the other.
And we are running a little bit late because we started a little bit late, so if you have to rush off, we won't hold it against you. Kim and Julian found each other on the internet. So did Joyce and John. Phil and I met the old-fashioned way, face-to-face in the college library, and I don't think we would have ever found each other in an online universe with nothing to go on but profiles written to attract like-minded companions. He had to win me over with conversation, persistence, and the coup de grace, a love letter he wrote me in French. We're so different that if we'd undergone premarital counseling, the counselor probably would have said, "Well, kids, you need to think long and hard about this." But we were young and indomitable, in love with the world and each other. We thought our different opinions and attitudes were quite charming. By way of example, I keep things. I still have that letter in French. And he throws them out. He tends toward excess, and I'm excessive only about moderation. He follows the stock market. I follow politics. He's reading Martin Heidegger. I'm reading Ann Patchett. He looks for evidence and proof. I like mystery and wonder. He wants to know what kinds of trees make up the forest. I just want to be in the woods. He knows the names of the birds and what their migration patterns are. I know the names of the characters on the Game of Thrones and what family they're in. He gave me a softball and a mitt for our first anniversary, and I started to throw and catch. I introduced him to Eudora Welty, and he started reading Southern stories. He's good with numbers and has always known how to calculate the volume of a cube, but he used not to know what grades our sons were in. I think he knows their birthdays now, but he depends on me for everyone else's. Trendy tests show a dominant left brain for him and right brain for me. Decision-making based on thought and the five senses for him. Feeling and intuition for me. My Enneagram type is the peacemaker. His moves between the observer and the leader. It's obvious that all you have to do to get a fully functioning human being is put us together. When I retired from my corporate communications job, I started writing non-corporate, strictly personal essays. This was while Phil was practicing retirement. He would take several days off a week in good weather and bad, just to see how he would cope with being at home. He found plenty to do in the garden and in the kitchen and in the community. So he said, if I have 3 bad days in a row at work, I'm gone. Then it became 2 bad days, and finally all it took was 1. I think it was the day he found out that everyone would have to have a cell phone and a pager and be on call all the time. This is going too far, he said. I'm a pharmacologist, not a policeman or a paramedic, for crying out loud. So when he phoned the personnel office and asked what he needed to do to retire, he was told to go to the website and click on a button. That did it. So he retired in 2003, still a scientist, but a scientist with no assignments but his own. He started expanding the vegetable garden, going to workshops on pastured poultry, learning about soil, planting more trees, volunteering at hospice, and reading books like The Chemistry of Food. Later, he chose to study a course on writing personal essays and took to it like the proverbial duck to water. He used to teach as well as do research when he lived in Memphis, so I figured he would teach again someday. One of his early retirement goals was to revisit his entire liberal arts education because he said he was too young to appreciate it in college. He got as far as philosophy, and then he stayed there, going wider and deeper in his readings. It's a path paved with ideas, which are like seeds that get planted in good soil. With enough water and light, they turn into something else, something bigger. He knows a lot about planting, both real and metaphorical. After growing blueberries, strawberries, and raspberries, he wanted to try mulberries. So he read about varieties and soil requirements and then bought and planted not 1, not 2, but 8 mulberry trees. In spite of the nursery rhyme, mulberries grow on trees, not bushes. He still plants fruit trees, studies philosophy, and teaches courses now at Ollie. Science? Gardening? Food? No, he's teaching essay writing. When he got interested in writing, he wanted to read about writing. So I gave him books on writing by my favorite writers, Natalie Goldberg and Annie Lamott. Then he sought his own teachers and got so many books about writing that we had to give away a lot of other books so we could find room on the bookshelf. One of the keys to a successful marriage is generosity. which includes maintaining a generous attitude toward each other's interests and activities. With generosity comes a kind of grace that prevents complaining, keeping score, and that bane of all relationships, bickering. Sometimes it just means cultivating goodwill in the face of extravagant purchases of fruit trees, flowering plants, and gardening equipment. Or goodwill when we both go to church or to a political meeting, although only one of us is really interested. Or goodwill when we write a book together and have to be each other's editors and critics. Think about all those differences I listed before, and you'll see that they aren't barriers. They're more like ballast, because they provide balance and prevent boredom. May all couples who promise to support each other forever in marriage be able to celebrate their differences and enjoy the mulberries. Thank you for being such a great audience.
Thank you very much.